they want to be in the room where it happened. You knew it was gonna, we were gonna get to that sooner or later. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Real History. I am your host, Jared Frederick, and I am joined by...
Emily Doherty. Hi, everyone.
And Emily, as our repeat viewers know, is an expert in 18th century history and material culture, and we could really think of no better person to have to be a guest host as we analyze HBO's acclaimed miniseries, John Adams. So we left off last time by seeing John Adams in a not so great state of affairs while he was serving in a diplomatic capacity in Holland, but he has reason to have his spirits boosted a little bit in this episode, as we will be seeing. So, where are his adventures going to take him next? Let's go ahead and find out as we take a look at episode 4, Reunion of John Adams. I kind of want a bed like that so I can put my books up there and just kind of like pull them down, but I'm tall and I'd probably hit my feet against the wall with it.
I was just reading about those beds the other day.
They're making a comeback, I think.
Yeah, they were super popular in the 17th century, and sometimes they'd have like one on top of another, but in the 18th century they lost popularity, so you find them in places where things haven't been updated yet.
The British are defeated. Look.
In the last episode, we talked a little bit about everybody receiving the news at a different time, and I can only imagine being not only, far away from your family, but then receiving this news and being in a foreign country where it means something different to you than everyone around you.
Very bittersweet moment, I suspect. But this probably places us November of 1781, which is when Adams found out.
Sir, all will be fine. All will be fine, sir.
Some good snot acting. That's how you know it's good.
And I've said it before and I'll say it again, there are these great little moments of subtlety where his character doesn't say anything because he doesn't need to. His facial expression does it all on its own, and that's a great example as such.
Our directors have agreed to an initial loan of 5 million Dutch guilders.
I love this scene because the tables have turned. If we think about his interaction in the previous episode with these people who are going to potentially bankroll him, now he's behind the table, he's smoking the cigar, he's in the power of authority, and they're the ones coming hat in hand because the United States has demonstrated its ability to resist the British.
We are very sorry to hear that you will leave us so soon.
Yes, well, I am needed in Paris.
I love those fuzzy wigs, man. They're very popular in the mid-18th century, and they're just, they're so good.
I suppose wig making as such has become a very niche market these days, but I'm sure there's some like living history sutler out there somewhere.
Oh yes, in
that
fact,
makes them like that.
There's a couple really good places you can go, and then some freelancers. I have a few friends who are 18th century wig makers.
I am not surprised.
Mrs. Adams.
You have to appreciate like the fainted formality here. They just want to embrace each other. It's been a long time since they've seen one another. But there's the public life and then there's the private life. I like this scene for that reason. And then of course things get a little bit more up close and personal.
Well, and it's interesting, the public life does extend to servants and enslaved people within your household to some extent, especially if they're not people who are in your employment.
Taking the liberty of making this room into my office.
It does do a good job of showing that, though there were some bigger houses in colonial and the new federal America, it's not like what you're going to find in Europe, and that's a theme that is often said when people go to visit the colonies, is that it feels very different from what people are used to.
Yeah, they aren't in Braintree anymore.
No.
That's for sure. Oh, the wig comes
The
off.
wig comes
you
off.
know? You know, though, like, in earlier scenes where people rip off their wigs, you know, you see their teeth slowly deteriorating throughout the film. Founding fathers making love, you know, on screen. It demythologizes them. It humanizes them. I mean, you know, they have their flaws, their fallibilities, and their human desires, just like anybody else. And as we've said time and time again, I think that's one place where this series succeeds.
Yes. I will point out while it's still on that she's actually, her fashion is moving forward, which I love. She's got a 1780s gown on, which I find to be a very comfortable kind of gown to wear. It's a transitional gown before you get into that Regency or Federal era.
I came here with many harsh words for you, John.
I will say in modern film and stage, when you're filming a scene that has any sort of intimacy or violence, many places are now employing intimacy coaches the same way you would employ somebody who would script a sword fight. And that's becoming the new practice. I'm sure just based on when this was filmed, probably that wasn't the case, but I do think that's a really good step forward in the industry, that you can create these tender moments in a really safe way.
Interesting production note.
To write of my disgrace, to burden you with my trials here, knowing of all of those you had to face at home.
I do think it's interesting that they use the intimate moment to say things that these characters are kind of their driving force through this series.
And now that you are triumphant, can you open your heart to me again?
Even the peak of her stays that you can see are transitional stays, and boy do I love it, because if you want to make a appropriate outfit, you have to start with the right shape.
Your wisdom and your passion for your country is said to inform your husband's every decision.
You do me more credit than I deserve. So.
Kind of a fuzzy feel-good moment, because like everyone's kind of on the same page, and independence has been won, but this is a calm before the storm.
Yes.
Of course, because they're still friends, but you know deep down inside that it's not gonna last, and it makes you feel kind of sad as a result.
There are moments in history where I wish I could scream at people, "Do you know what's coming?" And this might be one of them.
If ever there was a city designed to distract us from our troubles, it would be Paris.
Jefferson referencing seeking distraction in the city and going to Paris. You know, all in all, though, Paris perhaps being the exception, Jefferson is no fan of big cities.
No.
In fact, you know, he there's some points in his writings where he says, you know what, I kind of like, you know, epidemics, because like it'll convince people that they shouldn't live in cities and they should go live as virtuous farmers out in the countryside. So, but apparently Paris was exempt from that sort of sentiment.
So Jefferson's, his interest in Paris might have been a little bit more than sightseeing. Historians have debated whether he had an affair with a married woman by the name of Maria Causeway. And people can't prove whether or not they had any relationship physically, but he certainly did write about her in very tender terms.
Juicy.
Hot off the presses.
I'm resolved to renounce embarrassment in favor of enjoyment and a certain elevation of the spirits.
Man, I love transitional fashions. The 1780s, just give me an 80s of any century and I'm very happy. Usually it's big colors, big waistbands. I'm here for it.
If only the Adamses had Pac-Man.
cannot imagine losing a child and your wife in 1 year.
So that's about all the play that Martha Jefferson gets, is that one line from Abigail, losing a child and your wife in 1 year. Jefferson was pretty devastated after that. And it really changed his outlook on the world. People usually write about Martha Jefferson as a subnote in Thomas Jefferson's life, but I think in reality, Thomas sometimes saw himself as a footnote in his wife's legacy as well. They were very much tender towards one another.
Am I not exceptional in any way?
Certainly.
You know, come to think of it, something else that is surprisingly omitted from this is the fact that Adams is instrumental in the crafting of the Treaty of Paris.
Yes.
In 1783. You get a sense that his with Benjamin Franklin are done. And you know, I'm really surprised now, looking back on this series with a degree of hindsight, that perhaps wasn't included in the previous episode or at the beginning of this one. But already, Adams was concerned about what history was going to say about him. Mm-hmm. And it's around this time where he, says that quote or writes that line that was actually previously used in the series, that what was the revolution going to say about him? Mm-hmm. You know, he said that, history will say that, Benjamin Franklin stuck his lightning rod into the ground and out springs George Washington. And so he's already showing those concerns about being the forgotten founding father.
Pardon me, Mrs. Adams. It is Mrs. Adams, is it not? An honor. Madam, I shall rise to apologize for not getting up.
It is interesting. We tend to get more from people who are most concerned about their place in history. You've got more from the Adamses and the Jeffersons than you do from the Patrick Henrys. You don't really much care what people say about them as long as they're doing the what they feel is right.
Franklin asks me to marry him many times.
Has he indeed? An inconvenience to Mrs. Franklin, surely.
So here you see Abigail Adams dressing down Benjamin Franklin for carrying on an affair while his wife is alive. And while I'm sure he did, in this case, Mrs. Franklin had already passed on in 1774. So in this case, Franklin is well within his rights to have whatever dalliance he should please to have.
It's too good a line, though, to let go, perhaps.
And very valid for much of his life.
But I fear it could prove a breach in the integrity of our revolutionary ideals, through which will pour the forces of reaction.
On the interwebs, Thomas Jefferson is constantly misquoted, and there's all sorts of quotes about him floating around social media that he never said.
Oh, yes.
Dr. Mr. Jefferson's pet topic is not the artful arrangement of political power, but the cordoning off of a space in which no power exists at all.
There's a lot of conversation throughout this episode about this impending constitution that is on the horizon, and perhaps that's more so for the benefit of the audience than what the actual historical personalities would have been discussing, because initially the aim of the convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation. Going into it, I don't think many people would have had the foresight to envision the Constitution that came out of it that eventually did. All that said, I really suspect that Jefferson and Adams were frantic in the fact that they were not there to participate in those conversations, because they want to be in the room where it happened. You knew it was gonna. We were gonna get to that sooner or later. So I think to an extent there's some grains of truth in these conversations.
Too far to be undone by petty rivalries.
It is no small thing to build a new world, gentlemen.
It is interesting that some of the pressure that is causing the need for a stronger central government and for a new constitution is coming out of Massachusetts. And it's coming out of a government that is asking for debts to be paid and taxes to be paid in a economy where there's no money to pay it, there's no coin that normal people can get their hands on, so they're being taken to court, they're having their goods seized, and that causes the stirrings of another rebellion. And so it becomes very clear that the Articles of Confederation aren't working on a grand scheme. Something has to be done. So I do wonder how much, since that was coming out of Massachusetts, a lot of it, Adams was aware of that in the back country of Massachusetts while he was overseas.
I stand corrected.
So our umbilical cord to Mother Earth has been severed for the first time in history.
There's a charming children's play in Colonial Williamsburg called What Goes Up, about the experiment of a balloon in the British court, and they put a bunch of animals in it and sent it up to see what would happen.
It's the equivalent of sending Ham the monkey
Yes,
into space.
it really was.
Yeah.
There was a balloon launched at the College of William and Mary in the late 18th century.
Eventually, one of these balloons crosses the English Channel, and Benjamin Franklin is actually the recipient of what's considered to be the first airmail delivery.
Of course he is.
On one of these contraptions. I believe one of the letters was from his estranged son, William, saying, "Hey, Dad, can we let bygones be bygones and like be friends again?" And Benjamin Franklin says, "Nope." "Oh, and I'm going to take your children away from you." Some of these scenes harken to Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon. A lot of these shots are very similar in their composure and the same soundtrack. This is where we hear a lot of classical music being incorporated into this film. They had the right Union Jack flag.
I was just going to say.
Some of these scenes are really incredible because this whole scene here on the staircase as they're preparing to go meet King George III, all that's computer generated. They took the interior of these spaces and they built steps, and there's green screen behind Paul Giamatti. And so in the production design and post-production, they really went out of their way to create these scenes in which they really could not film in person.
The United States of America have appointed me Minister Plenipotentiary to Your Majesty.
Try saying Minister Plenipotentiary. Plenipotentiary. I can't even. When you're nervous, it's just not going to happen.
It's definitely an awkward sort of situation here.
The happiest of men, if I can be instrumental in restoring the confidence and affection.
So there is documentary evidence as to what this encounter between John Adams and King George III was really like, and historian Andrew Roberts has this to say. At 1 p.m. on 1st June 1785, Adams went first to Lord Carmarthen's office in Cleveland Row, and then together with him across the road to St. James Palace. He was naturally a great object of attention, surrounded by government ministers, Anglican prelates, and European ambassadors. I went with his lordship through the Levee room into the king's closet, Adams wrote the next day to John Jay, the American Secretary of State. The door was shut, and I was left with His Majesty and the Secretary of State alone. I made 3 reverences, one at the door, another halfway, and a third before the presence, according to the usage established at this time and at the northern courts of Europe. The 3 small bows were indeed customary, but it was still a decent mark of respect for the king from the envoy of an independent republic which had just wrestled itself so dramatically away from his dominions. Adams handed the king his credentials and then made a formal 245-word statement that he had memorized about Congress's unanimous disposition and desire to cultivate the most friendly and liberal intercourse between your Majesty's subjects and their citizens, and their best wishes for your Majesty's health and happiness. My oh my. He ended by saying, I shall esteem myself the happiest of men if I can be instrumental in recommending my country more and more to your Majesty's royal benevolence, and of restoring an entire esteem, confidence, and affection, or in better words, the good old nature and good old humor between people who, though separated by an ocean and now under separate governments, have the same language, a similar religion, and a kindred blood. So there is an actual breakdown by John Adams in his own words as to how this rather awkward meeting commenced. And interestingly enough, you see a lot of that same language being used in his conclusion between the likes of Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt well over a century later. So the interesting beginning of the special relationship indeed.
Yes, well, I avow to your Majesty that I have no attachment to any country but my own.
Of course, Winston Churchill's mother was American, so kind of got back in there a little bit.
It is interesting. The end of the Declaration ends with that they wish to be friends in a time of peace, and they call the people of England brothers. So even from the outset of the Revolution, there are many people who have strong feelings about their British heritage.
And the king is played by the British captain off of Pirates of the Caribbean.
Yes,
so,
yes.
Yeah. Ultimate, like, figurehead of monarchy.
There you go.
I pray, Mr. Adams, that the United States does not suffer unduly from its want of a monarchy.
One of the best books that I've ever read about King George's declining health is called Princesses, the Six Daughters of King George. And it really shows in a human level what he was going through and what his family was going through. Mm-hmm. I think oftentimes it's really easy for us to make him into a caricature. And the author's name is Flora Fraser, and she does a really good job of making him into a human again, which I love. He's still fairly young. I believe he's in his 30s at this point. I'm in my 30s, and I'm not ready to rule a republic or a monarchy of any sort. I can tell you that.
Besides, I'm worried about the children. They are adults now, John. They have been without us for too long.
I mean, the thing is, really haven't been that long without them, because the children have been traveling with them during much of this time and stayed with them for a spell in England too, and so that isolation is a little bit forced in the script.
Again, you've got those celebratory artillery shots. You just want to watch out.
Someone's going to lose a leg.
Yes, I've remembered two other instances since we've been sitting here of people getting seriously injured in the 18th century. So just don't do it.
Chuck! Good heavens, you look...
Charles was really little, just 6 or 8 years prior to all this.
Yes, this happened very quickly. Meanwhile,
real growth spurt.
Yeah, the Adamses have not aged at all.
Grown, isn't it, yeah?
It's been a long time.
Yes,
indeed.
I do love the hat. There are lots of fashions that were actually being influenced by those early balloon flights, and one of them was hats. So there are lots of hats at this moment in time with the big balloon shape on top.
You must work more hours than exist in the day and more days than exist in the week.
I am well aware.
You are not.
It does show this scene shows the conflict between the two generations. The revolutionary generation that was old enough to fight and make diplomatic choices during the war, and then their children, who are the ones inheriting what their parents have done, but may have very different ideas about how they want to go about setting up this new nation. And there is a moment of friction where they're trying to hand this legacy over, and I can vouch that you don't always see eye to eye with your parents' generation about how things ought to be done. And so I think that's a really interesting moment to show there.
General Washington is unanimously acclaimed president with 69 votes, whereas I apparently am scorned by all but 34 of the electors.
So this election is different from the elections that we have today in that the electoral votes, I believe everybody cast 2 electoral votes, and you were essentially voting for 2 people. The person with the most votes would be president, and the second person would be the vice president.
Those in Congress.
Yes, yes. And those, you're not necessarily delineating, I want this person to be president and this is my vote for vice president. It's just the person with the most votes and the second most votes. Even though he ran for president, Adams is vice president based on those votes.
Mm-hmm. Imagine if we still did that today. That if you had it, and it leads to all sorts of questions. If if nemeses were compelled to work together, or is that even possible? Because as we see, it doesn't work out maybe too well with later on Adams and Jefferson.
It only lasts 2 elections, right? Washington and
votes, then all of them put together, and John Jay comes in third.
Nonetheless,
with 9.
I consider such a showing a stain upon my character.
I like the moment though where Adams is like, "This is a stain upon my character." And always leave it to Abigail to kind of reel him back to the real world and ground him in reality.
Again, I know I keep going back to it, but I really do see a lack of diversity in this crowd. When you think about this moment, there's going to be a mixing pot of people surrounding this event.
And I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Washington very famously, essentially whispers the oath of office. And while he was not ready to back away from this obligation, it wasn't necessarily a burden that he wanted. After all, he refers to the presidency as a glorious burden, which I think is a very fitting description of it. But, here's a guy who had been away from home for the better part of a decade. And, and then he gets like a year or 2 at home. And they're like, "Oh yeah, we want you to serve as president." He just wanted to take it easy, go back home, and enjoy a calm, peaceful life. And it was not to be.
I can imagine that conversation with his wife. It is significant. This is the first and last election that is this united behind one person. We have not since seen such a moment of unity in any presidential election in our country.
And the inauguration takes place in New York as well, because Washington D.C. does not exist yet. All right, so what are our thoughts on this episode with the homecoming?
I think it's a really fascinating look at the moment where you finally get to say we did it. I think you said earlier, and it was a really interesting statement, that there was kind of a moment of unity after the war, and it was sort of the parallel to the moment right after the Declaration of Independence. Before you get into the nitty-gritty and the work of creating a nation where everybody's on the same page. But I think we'll see that that's not going to last too terribly long here.
One of the things that strikes me about this episode, I think of all the episodes, it has the biggest geographic scope. It's in Holland, it's in France, it's in England. We're introduced and reintroduced to all of these very famous historical characters. We end up back in Boston, and then finally we end up in New York City. The story is all over the place in this episode, yet it's all very cohesive still. And that's the sign of a good, strong script, despite any of the historical liberties that it may take.
I have 2 book recommendations this week pertaining to Thomas Jefferson. we were talking about him a little bit earlier in this episode and about the fact that he was very influenced by the women in his life. So the first one is called The Women Jefferson Loved, and the second one is The Hemmingses of Monticello. And those were both recommended to me by my friend and scholar who studies Martha Jefferson, and her name is Nicole Brown. Nicole has done a Tom Talk through Monticello that I believe is archived on their website about Martha Jefferson and her influence on Thomas Jefferson's life. So I highly recommend looking up all three of those.
Very good suggestions. I too have one book to recommend, just one for this episode because it's a very big one. And it's a comparatively newer book, and I quoted it a little bit earlier, and it's called The Last King of America by historian Andrew Roberts, who has also written in-depth biographies on Napoleon and Churchill as well. But this is a good book because it also does some myth-busting in regard to King George III, who has often been deemed as insane or unhinged in a lot of historical depictions. And it's also a helpful book because it offers some very good context on this moment of transition as the American colonies are breaking away, as the title would suggest. And so for this week, my recommendation is The Last King of America. We welcome you, before we head out, to check us out on all of our other venues and sites. We have a very handy website, realhistoryfilms.com, where you can get all sorts of wonderful educational resources. We have a t-shirt store. You can follow us on Facebook for additional updates at Real History. And if you appreciate what we do, we welcome you to make a donation or become a subscriber on Patreon for additional perks and benefits as well, so we can keep this good content coming to you, our dedicated viewers. So Emily, thank you once again for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Real History as we continue to revisit John Adams.